Hello everyone and welcome to yet another Fun Fact Friday here at the Crockett Tavern Museum in Morristown, Tennessee. In our last episode, we discussed David Crockett's birth as well as some of the earliest memories and hardships he encountered. And yet in today's episode, we're going to discuss some more of those hardships that he endured, but we'll see that they were born of a stubbornness in the young David Crockett. Now in the year 1799, when David was about 13 years old, his father took the notion into his head to send him and his brothers to the schoolhouse of Master Benjamin Kitchen. But David had only attended school for the grand sum of 4 days before he got into a fight with a bully, and now fearing that the master would give him a whipping just for causing trouble, David decides to play hooky and convinces his brothers to cover for him while he does so, and he successfully plays hooky for about a week, until finally, curious as to the boy's absence, Master Kitchen writes a letter home to John inquiring as to his whereabouts. And on that fateful day when David returns home, pretending as though he had been at school getting his lessons, his father John is standing in the doorway, letter in hand, waiting on him. Now, needless to say, John Crockett was irate at the fact of the matter that David had been wasting the hard-earned money he had put together for his education. But it certainly didn't help the fact that he was also indulging in a little bit too much whiskey at the same time. Nonetheless, we see that John goes up and tells young David that he's heard about all of this, and that if he does not return to school immediately, he'll whip him worse than the master. But upon seeing that the young lad was rather adamant about heading back down the schoolhouse road, his father John decides to, in a fatherly manner, encourage the boy's journey. And doing so, he grabs a great big hickory switch and takes off after him. And finally, the two took off running down the road. But mind you, it wasn't the schoolhouse road, for Crockett was trying to get far t'other way as possible. But finally, after a mile's worth of hard running, David is able to outdistance his paw and hide himself off in the brush. And as he sits there hidden, watching his father pass by, he's able to contemplate and realize that now he can't go back home either, because if he does, he's going to get his hide tanned. So the immediate solution that presents itself to him is to run away from home and stay on the road working odd jobs until he thinks things have cooled down enough for him to return home. And this would lead young David Crockett to Jesse Cheek, wherein he hired himself on as a cattle driver and saw himself heading all the way to Front Royal. But once arriving at Front Royal, the band had split up, and young Crockett found himself somewhat on his own until he had the good fortune to meet a wagoner named Adam Myers, with whom Crockett agreed to make the journey to Gerardstown to deliver a load. While on the way to Gerardstown, Crockett runs into one of his younger brothers who was returning home, and his brother tried to convince him to return home, but although David really wanted to badly return home, the thought of the whipping just could not get itself out of his mind, and that ended all negotiations. And so he continued on to Gerardstown with Adam Myers, whereupon, after they delivered their load, they found a problem was awaiting them, because there was no backload for them to return. And so Mr. Myers told David that he could stay there in Gerardstown and work while he went off to find a backload that they could take. Well, after a brief period of time, Mr. Myers returns back to David, picks him up, and they find themselves heading all the way to Baltimore, Maryland. Whereupon the young frontier lad is amazed at the sight of these towering buildings and the swaying mast of the ships. And at one point, his curiosity got the better of him and compelled him to step on board the deck of one of these ships. Whereupon he was approached by the captain of said ship, and he inquired as to whether or not the young lad would wish to sign on as a cabin boy on a voyage to London. Now, David states that he had no idea of where London was, no more than where the moon was. But he decided that it was worth it because he could avoid that whipping. But when he went back to Mr. Myers in order to retrieve his belongings as well as his money, Adam put his foot down and said that Crockett wasn't going anywhere. And if he tried to cause any more trouble, he'd go ahead and take David immediately back to his father, and he'd get that promised whipping. So David, unfortunately, had to stay on with Mr. Myers. But at this point, he was determined to get away from that man. And so early one morning, his chance came while Myers was sound asleep, and David crept away from him with nary a thing to his name except the clothes on his back. Well, fortune would have it that as he was making his way down the road, there was another man by the name of Myers, Henry was his name, who came across the young lad. And when he inquired as to David's journeys and what in the world he was doing there by himself, the boy could not but help himself, and he broke down into tears and told Henry what had happened at the hand of Adam Myers. Upon this, Henry threatened to beat the money out of Adam Myers or die trying. And they rode up there and met up with Adam, much to his chagrin, and they confronted him about it. And every so often, in between all the oaths and cursing that Henry was throwing towards Adam, he'd crack his whip fiercely, threatening him. But there was nothing for it, because Adam Myers said that he had unfortunately lost the boy's money. And realizing that their efforts were in vain, David and Henry Myers decided to journey along together, which they did so for a short period of time, before yet again the slow pace of the wagons proved to be too much for the boy, and he decides to set out for home by himself. But before he does so, Henry Myers and the other wagoners were able to raise together a pot of $3 to help bear the expenses of his journey. But the money soon gave out, and David was forced to bind himself out again, at first to a man named James Caldwell, and then to a hatter named Elijah Griffith, who he had only worked for the short period of about 18 months before Mr. Griffith, heavily in debt, closed up his shop without so much as a word and left the country, leaving poor David without any money. But fortunately, the young lad was resilient, and he was able to find other work to get some money to bear his journey home. Now, at this point, he comes across the New River, whereupon he wished to cross over. But the New River was so swollen that the white caps were flying, and try as he could not convince any ferryman to take him across. But Crockett was resolute that he was going to get across the New River, and he does so by getting a hold of a canoe, tying his clothes to the bow, and setting out. But no sooner did he get off the banks than he deeply wished to be back on them, because the white caps were flying so and splashing him with cold water that he was not only nearly frozen to death, but the waves threatened to capsize him. But through great exertions, David finally makes his way to the opposite end of the shore, and although he was near dead from hypothermia, he stops to take a drop of the creature, or whiskey, and with a little bit of warmth, he makes his way to a nearby farmhouse, wherein he found food, warmth, and relaxation. From there, the young lad continued onwards, until finally he stopped over at the home of one of his brothers in Sullivan County, Tennessee. He stayed with him for a short period of time before setting out on his journey home. And finally, after 2.5 years, David smelled the smoke just around the bend in the road and saw his father's tavern. But when David made his way in and asked for accommodations, he did not let them know who he was, because he wanted to see if they would recognize him. And also he wondered that possibly, due to the prospects of him having been gone so long, had they not already given him up for dead. But when it was time for everyone to sit at the table and take in the evening meal, it was David's sister, possibly Elizabeth, who recognized him and jumped up from the table and seized him by the neck, exclaiming, "Here is my brother!" And at this, the family shed a heap of tears. And the young lad said in later years that he was so humbled by this warm reception that he would much rather face 100 whippings than as to ever cause his family that much heartache ever again. Well, folks, this concludes yet another chapter in the life of David Crockett, and as always, we want to thank you for coming along so much as we journey through the 18th and 19th century, and of course in this month, journey through the life of David Crockett. As always, your support on Facebook and YouTube is greatly appreciated, but the best means of support is by coming out to the Crockett Tavern, and the hours of operation as well as admissions will be listed in a description attached to the video. Until next week, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum, signing off for now, saying goodbye and God bless.